Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Building Safer, Smarter Industries, Why PSM is a Strategic Investment, presented by Theresa Lewis and Michael Metcalfe-Smith. Theresa has over 10 years of process safety experience in industry and consulting. She is a member of AICHE PSD Careers and Education Committee. She is also experienced in comprehensive PSM program implementation with a focus on FSS and QRA, process hazard analysis, combustible dust hazards, and management of change. Michael, he graduated with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Waterloo with a specialization in energy and environmental systems and processes. He has 2.5 years experience with quantitative risk assessments with BakerRisk and is a member of BakerRisk LCE Biofuels Group. The BakerRisk Biofuels team includes Alexander Cardoso, Murtaza Gandhi, along with our presenters Theresa, Michael, and others. Today, Theresa and Michael will cover the fundamentals of process safety management, PSM, benefits of PSM beyond regulatory compliance, an overview and implementation of key elements, and financial benefits of a PS program. Now, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. Please type any questions you have into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. Our technical staff will respond to the questions. So thank you to Alex Cardoso for being here with us today to answer those questions in the chat. Finally, at the close of our webinar, please provide feedback by responding to our survey that will pop up for you, and we'll also send a link with our follow-up email. We're excited to have Theresa and Michael present today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to our presenters.
Thanks, Naomi. Today's webinar is going to be divided up into 5 main sections. The first section is going to be an introduction to process safety and, by extension, process safety management. Then we're going to transition into talking about how process safety is not just a regulatory requirement, and we'll get into what organizations stand to gain if they have good, comprehensive process safety. Next, we'll talk about a couple of key elements of process safety management, specifically management of change in process safety information. Then we'll talk a little bit about how to get started when implementing a process safety program, and then we'll go over some key takeaways from the webinar and then answer some questions. Now I'm going to hand it off to Theresa.
All right, thank you, Michael. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So like Michael said, we're going to start out with the fundamentals of what process safety is. So that makes sure that we're all starting from the same point. And as we get into more of the details around the different elements later on in this webinar, we're all starting from a similar starting point. So process safety, fundamentally, what it is at its core is a framework or management system. And its purpose is to safely handle hazardous chemicals and to prevent releases of those chemicals that can lead to incidents involving fires, explosions, or toxic exposures. So a lot of times you'll hear people say that the goal of process safety, very simply, is to try to keep it in the pipes, to prevent releases and to prevent the negative consequences that occur from those releases. And in order to do that, process safety tries to build a comprehensive management system that pulls in multiple different elements to prevent those releases from occurring. It can be a little easier to define process safety, what it is, by first defining what it's not. So process safety should not be confused with occupational safety. A lot of times whenever you are talking about a good safety program in a plant or talking about a good safety record, people's first thought immediately goes to occupational safety and looking at things like slips, trips, and falls, having a good ergonomics program, focusing on that individual worker safety. They typically are looking at those events that are higher in frequency, but have a lower impact per event. And plants can have a very comprehensive, a very good occupational safety program, but that doesn't necessarily translate into having a good process safety program. And so it's very important to first define the difference between those two things, because oftentimes when that focus is on occupational safety, process safety can get missed. So process safety, it's focusing on those highly hazardous chemicals, on those highly flammable or toxic materials, specifically ones that are being handled in larger quantities. These are chemicals that if you were to have a release, or if you were to have an incident, say with reactive chemistry, you could have an effect of a fire, of a toxic cloud or toxic exposure, or having an explosion. These are typically those low frequency events that are happening less often, but they have a higher impact. And so while sometimes these events can be not focused on because they're not being seen as often, whenever you do have a fire, a toxic exposure, or an explosion at a plant or a facility, those are those really high impact events that can result in a higher loss of life or a higher business impact because of downtime. And so having a good process safety program is just as important as having a good occupational safety program. So now that we've defined the difference between those two, we're going to talk a little bit about the regulations around process safety. So in the United States, process safety is regulated under OSHA, under the Process Safety Management Standard. There's also the Environmental Protection Agency, the RMP rule. And these two standards, these are regulating flammables and toxics that are specifically handled in bulk quantities at plants. So for OSHA PSM, that's applicable to flammables in quantities greater than 10,000 pounds in a process, as well as select toxics that are listed in Appendix A of that regulation. EPA RMP has a very similar list of toxics, so there's often a lot of overlap in between what's regulated under PSM or EPA RMP. But the important thing to focus on, and what we are going to be discussing as part of this webinar, is that even if a process or an entire facility are not regulated under PSM or RMP, and even if they're not subject to those requirements, they can still benefit from process safety principles. And there is still a large impact that can be had in terms of the safety of a plant and safe operations by implementing some or all of those requirements. If you're not in the United States, there are other global regulations around process safety. So in EU, there's the Seveso directive. There are also many other countries that have implemented or are on the process of implementing process safety requirements in their legal systems. So outside of the US, processes can still be subject to those requirements. And regardless of if they're regulated or not, there's still many benefits to be had by implementing process safety. So going into more of what those benefits are, to define those in a little bit more detail, fundamentally, process safety is a good business practice. So beyond the benefits of reducing incidents, there are many other things that come out of implementing process safety that we'll be going into throughout this webinar. But I wanted to start with a quote from Trevor Kletz. If you've gone to process safety conventions, like I don't think I can go to the Global Congress on Process Safety without seeing this quote at least a couple times. And that's because it's a really good quote, and it really kind of defines what we're getting at when we talk about incident prevention. And so the quote is, there's an old saying, if you think safety is expensive, try an accident. So oftentimes, one of the things that gets in the way of implementing safety programs, and specifically implementing process safety programs, is that there is a cost involved. There is a time commitment involved. But the benefits of incidents that have not occurred and that have been prevented, they can be hard to quantify. But whenever a facility ends up having an incident, the impacts of that incident are very far-ranging, going from resulting in incidents of fatalities all the way to potentially shutting down facilities. So the Center for Chemical Process Safety, they released a monograph called How Business Financial Decisions Impact Process Safety Performance, which I would highly recommend. And they say that process safety, that it's fundamentally a good business practice because it preserves life, property, reputation, and the right to operate. And so on this next slide, I will be going into some of those more concrete benefits. So at a baseline, if a process or a facility is required to implement process safety, it needs to do so to meet those legal and those regulatory requirements. So this is compliance with standards like OSHA PSM, which I already mentioned, but also the general duty clause, which requires companies to provide workers with a workplace that's free of recognized hazards. In addition, you can reduce incident rates by implementing process safety. That is one of the core purposes of process safety, is to reduce incidents. But outside of reducing those catastrophic incidents, you can also reduce those smaller releases or even those smaller quality incidents that can cause downtime or scrapped product. It also ensures business continuity. So again, by reducing downtime, both due to potential issues with just not maintaining your equipment or not having a good system in place for that, incidents also cause a lot of downtime. So in order to keep operations running smoothly, that's something that process safety can have that additional benefit with. Some more benefits are preserving assets. So one of the elements, which Michael will be going into a little bit more detail in a minute, is mechanical integrity. So by standardizing inspections, testing, and preventative maintenance programs, it can, again, the business will continue to run smoothly. You won't have as much downtime. You won't have as many issues with equipment. You can optimize operations. So documentation of training as well as having standard operating procedures are two additional requirements of process safety. So by running smoothly, you can reduce waste, you can reduce deviations, you can reduce operator error due to just not having that consistent training. And then lastly, there's that opportunity to adapt to new opportunities, because proactively managing changes, both in terms of the process and organizational changes, by having a system in place, it makes it much easier to adopt new practices or to adapt to new business opportunities quickly whenever you already have that framework in place. So at a high level, those are some of the many benefits of process safety, showing that it goes beyond but just meeting regulatory requirements or simply reducing incidents. It's also just a good business practice. So on this next slide, Michael will be talking about some of the elements of process safety.
Thanks, Theresa. The specific regulation that outlines process safety management is OSHA 1910.119. The standard outlines 14 different elements that comprise a successful PSM program. And you'll notice that together, these elements, they form an arch. And under that arch is the protection of your employees. The foundation of any successful PSM program is commitment from management. Successful PSM, it's not just about checking the box for each of these 14 elements. It's really about creating a culture that is supported and developed by all levels of an organization. Now, implementing 14 different elements may seem daunting, but implementing them, it's a gradual process. An effective PSM program, it's not something that's going to be developed overnight. At first, you can start with simple procedures, and this can be things like developing a straightforward way of reviewing hazards and managing changes. The first focus is developing those basic procedures for the different PSM elements and getting those procedures written down and established. As the organization gets more comfortable, these procedures can be developed further and expanded upon. Once the procedures for different elements are sufficiently developed, they will start to connect with one another, and then you're going to have a cohesive PSM program. A little later, we're going to go into more depth with two of the PSM elements, which are management of change and process safety information. Next slide. Now we're going to take a look at a few incidents involving facilities that were not required to have a PSM plan in place. The first is a Foundation Food Group, which has a poultry facility in Gainesville, Georgia. As you can imagine, a poultry plant would not be dealing with enough hazardous materials to trigger the requirement for a PSM program. However, there was a release from the liquid nitrogen control system in a freezer room. The liquid nitrogen quickly vaporized, and 6 workers in the freezer room asphyxiated, and they sadly passed away. 3 other workers and a firefighter were also injured due to asphyxiation-related injuries. OSHA, they do not list nitrogen as a hazardous chemical, but Foundation Food Group was still fined by OSHA for not having sufficient atmospheric monitoring and alarm systems, insufficient emergency planning and response, insufficient training, and also having a subpar PSM system. They were fined almost $1 million, and their share price also saw a dip. And that's a trend that is seen at other organizations that have a major incident. There was an analysis that considered 12 companies that recently had an accident, and on average, the share price of those companies dropped 15% over the course of 24 months. Next slide. The next case study we'll be looking at is in the RNG space, and it occurred at a sewage treatment plant in Avonmouth, Bristol, in the UK. There was hot work being performed on a biosolid silo, and unbeknownst to the workers on the silo, the biosolids had produced methane, and that was in the headspace of the silo. The workers on the silo were using angle grinders, and the sparks ignited the methane, causing the silo to explode. The silo didn't have a flame arrestor installed because Wessex Water had not anticipated the presence of methane in that headspace. Staff also claimed that an ignition risk assessment was not performed before starting the work on the silo. And the remarkable thing was that in the headspace of the silo, it was estimated to contain between 250 to 500 pounds of methane, which is 20 times less than the OSHA PSM threshold of 10,000 pounds. Next slide. Sadly, there were 4 people working on that silo, and they were all killed by the explosion. And one of the people killed was a 16-year-old apprentice. This is an example of what can happen when hot work is treated as a routine action as opposed to a process critical action. And in the fallout of this accident, there was a conversation in the UK about the safety and viability of RNG long term. The reputation of Wessex Water also worsened significantly, and they faced a lot of public scrutiny. There has not been a report on the accident released to the public, so it's hard to say what the financial implications are. However, since the explosion, Wessex Water has faced prolonged regulatory scrutiny, and they have been forced to perform regular systemic safety reviews, which very closely emulates the requirements of a PSM program. And this just shows that even though OSHA PSM is not a requirement, it still should be thought of as a best practice globally. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Theresa to talk a little bit about hot work.
Yeah, so one of the common themes that we see whenever we look at incidents like that is that there are so many root causes that it comes down to. So, like one of the ones that Michael mentioned was they hadn't performed a risk assessment. They didn't realize the hazards or the need to install a flame arrestor. Another one is not having a hot work program that really evaluated the hazards surrounding that hot work. So, hot work is one of the elements of PSM. And we have a slide on here. We aren't going as in depth with this one as we are next with some of our other key elements. But I wanted to talk about hot work permits because the requirement to issue hot work permits, it is required on PSM covered processes. But the OSHA standard, what it does is it refers you back to practices required in another OSHA standard on welding, cutting, and brazing. So really, like many of the process safety elements, this is a performance-based standard that is either echoing requirements from other standards or really allowing companies to implement them in a way that is effective. And like many other process safety elements, this really integrates well into existing programs and practices. So many facilities, not even ones that are not PSM covered, are still required to have a hot work program, are required to do some of these reviews required under PSM. And so that interconnectivity between process safety management, between good engineering practices, and between existing safety and health standards, they all intertwine, they often interact. And as we talk about starting up or strengthening a process safety program, many of these do not need to be started from scratch. They don't need to be developed independently from existing programs. Many of them interact or build on what facilities already have in place. And so fundamentally, one of the things that is really important to reiterate, both for process safety and safety in general, is that it's not separate from operations. It's not a separate program from good operations. Effective process safety improves operations, and they should be working together and building on each other so that process safety programs aren't being implemented or developed in a vacuum. They should be building on existing standards. And so with that, I will dive into our first key focus element, which is management of change. So management of change, and I am going to be saying the words management system quite a bit throughout this webinar because fundamentally that's what process safety is. So management of change, it is a management system, and the goal is to review and approve changes before implementation. So these can be changes to procedures, to processes, they can be introducing a new raw material, they can be changing the standard operating conditions, pressure and temperature in a process. It could be changing the order of steps and making sure the operators are trained on those. It could be organizational changes. But fundamentally, the goal of a good MOC program is to prevent unintended consequences from those changes and from those undocumented or unreviewed changes. So this process flow, this is in general what an MOC program looks like. There's different aspects of different parts of this process. They can be done in different ways. But fundamentally, whenever you look at an effective management of change program, it starts with identifying the change that needs to be made or that someone wants to make. There's then a risk assessment of the potential impacts. So this can be for a capital project. This could be a full process hazard analysis being completed through multiple stages. This could be a small checklist that's looked at by one or two people to review those changes and to review what could potentially happen that's not intended. Next, you get approval from key parties. So this is typically pulling in different groups at the plant, so EHS, engineering, production, maintenance, having that review and approval to get those perspectives from different people who may be affected by the change or may have more information about the change. Moving on from there, you implement the change and then you go through a pre-startup safety review where you ensure that you've updated documentation, you've updated procedures, you've updated your process safety information, and ensuring that affected personnel have been trained. So this could be, if it's something that affects operators, making sure that they are aware of that change, they've reviewed the updated procedures, and they've signed off that they have been trained on that change. This could be training for maintenance personnel. This is training for anyone who's been affected by that change, so not just operations. Lastly, you've done your pre-startup safety review, you do your startup. There's also follow-up, making sure that any post-change actions have been closed out, you filed all your documentation appropriately, and then there's also an audit check step to this. So going through that cycle of plan, do, check, act, is making sure that your program is acting the way that you intended it to work, that you actually are following through on that documentation, you've done your training, and that the program is effective and being implemented the way it's intended. So that's a high-level overview of what management of change looks like. But going into what management of change is and the benefits of managing change, one of the key things to note here is that effective change management, it is a best practice across industries. So management of change is one of the elements of process safety that has been widely implemented or is being widely implemented, even for facilities that don't require it or aren't required to have it due to PSM. And that's because the benefits of MOC on effective operations are very widespread. So initially you have safer operations with fewer incidents. As you go through the risk assessment, as you go through the approvals for those changes, you're usually catching things that may not have been caught if you didn't have a formal process. So as part of that, you're making sure that you're getting that review from the key parties. You can reduce downtime from unplanned changes. This goes back to making sure that the equipment that you're putting in or the things that you're updating or changing are appropriate. So I always like to pull this back to maintenance because if you are going out there, you're changing the type of equipment that you have in your plant, it's not being documented, that information isn't getting sent into your CMMS system, your maintenance guys aren't getting trained on it, that can create a lot of issues down the road where things aren't getting updated. If you have a breakdown or a shutdown, you may not have the spare parts you need. You may not have the people aware of even what was installed. So there's a lot that goes into just the documentation side of when you change a single thing in a plant. There's also increased visibility for all stakeholders. So these are the stakeholders at the plant or up in management at your organization who are having the opportunity to review the change, to make those longer term decisions. You also, as part of that training requirement, will have better trained operations and maintenance personnel. So you're making sure that people are informed of the change, they're being trained on it to the level that they need to be trained on it, and then you're documenting that training. And then lastly, we have accurate and up-to-date process safety information. So in a couple minutes, Michael will be talking a lot more about process safety information and how it's a key element of a PSM program. But management of change is a really good way to ensure that your process safety information is getting updated anytime a change is made. So as part of that process where you're going through a change, you're redlining your PNIDs, you're ensuring that those are getting updated, you're making sure that any changes that you make, that those are getting documented in every piece of process safety information that you have. So it maintains that somewhat evergreen of the process safety information so that it's not getting out of date. So people often say the phrase, you can't manage what you don't measure. I changed this, you can't manage what you didn't document. If you're making changes in your facility, if you're not documenting those changes, you're not reviewing them, you're going to have a lot of inaccuracies in your systems. All of the different elements of process safety, they need to work together because all of these are different parts and pieces of an overall management system. So I think as we've been talking, we can see that management of change, like every other element, it touches on many other parts of process safety. So if you aren't managing change, if you aren't training people, updating your documentation, doing those hazard reviews, you're going to have issues downstream. And establishing a system to manage change, what it fundamentally does is reduce those unintended consequences. So correctly managing change, correctly going through that process, it keeps your process safety system standing. So at this point, I will hand it back to Michael to talk about process safety information.
Thanks, Theresa. So process safety information, which is also referred to as PSI, it can really be thought of as your compass for decision making. It quite literally gives you the orientation you need before taking any step or deviation in your process. It'll tell you what chemicals you're dealing with, how equipment is designed to operate, and where the limits of that equipment truly are. PSI, it also keeps you aligned with what's safe, what's possible, and what could go wrong. It can be thought of almost as a reference point that keeps the entire team grounded. So instead of navigating blindly, you're making informed, confident decisions that protect people, equipment, and the process itself. Like management of change, it's important to think of PSI as an industry best practice and not just a requirement of PSM where you're checking a box. When we do talk about PSI, we usually break it up into three key elements. Chemical information, which includes things like SDSs and permissible exposure limits. The next is process technology information, so your PFDs, safe operating limits, and your process chemistry. The third is process equipment information, and that includes things like your PNIDs, your materials of construction, applicable design codes and standards, release systems, as well as electrical classification. Next slide. Essentially, if you know your process, you can protect your people. PSI can prevent accidents by identifying hazards before they lead to potentially catastrophic incidents. You develop a clear understanding of the process limits and the equipment capabilities. Your decision making will be more informed during maintenance, troubleshooting, as well as emergency response. PSI enables effective training by providing accurate information to personnel, and things like onboarding new personnel becomes an easier, more straightforward process. Additionally, you stand to gain or more valuable information during safety studies like HAZOPs, quantitative risk assessments, and failure mode and effects analyses because you ultimately make less assumptions because your process info is more accessible. An extension of that is having good PSI is also good for contractors as they will likely not have as much familiarity with your process before starting work. It also strengthens your safety culture by making key information open and visible to everyone. When people can clearly see the hazards, the limits, and the expectations, it creates transparency. And that transparency naturally leads to accountability because everyone understands what safe operation looks like and what their responsibilities are. With PSI, the whole team works from the same facts and there is less gaps in knowledge from person to person. Next slide. There's also a lot of value in keeping good PSI. You'll likely have more uptime, which will consequently protect revenue. Good PSI can also lower insurance costs because it shows insurers that you truly understand your hazards. When your chemical data, equipment limits, and safety information are clear and well maintained, insurers will see a facility that's managing risk proactively, and they will reward that. Strong process safety practices and good documentation lead to better risk ratings, which then translates into lower premiums. Good PSI, it's also going to save money because it prevents maintenance mistakes as well as project rework. When drawings and technical data are accurate, crews don't waste time fixing the wrong problem or redoing work caused by outdated or incorrect information. Clear PSI, it just makes everyone's jobs easier. When employees have clear and accurate information about the process that they're working on and how equipment works and what those limits are, they can work with confidence instead of feeling a sense of frustration. That clarity reduces errors, reduces stress, and it just helps people do their jobs well, which we all want. Effective PSI will also enable smarter capital spending because it gives you a clear picture of what your facility actually needs. When your technical data and equipment specs and design limits are accurate, you avoid oversizing equipment or duplicating systems or investing fixes into problems that just don't really exist. Contractors, they also become far more effective because they walk in with the right information from day one. When everything is accurate and controlled, contractors, they're just going to spend less time hunting for answers and more time actually doing the job that they came in to do. Now, I'm going to hand it back off to Theresa to talk a bit about implementing a process safety program.
So we focused on two specific elements of process safety, and we talked a little bit around where you would start with those. But now I'm going to talk through how you would get started on an overall process safety program. And this can apply whether you have no process safety program at your facility already, or if you already are implementing some of the elements of process safety, but recognize that they need to be improved or strengthened. This is also a good way to get started with that. So this is going to be at a somewhat high level because there are a lot of specifics with each of these key elements. But fundamentally, to have a good process safety program, there needs to be that commitment. It needs to start with management. You also need to get the commitment from the folks at the site, from the different organizations at the site itself. But starting with that management commitment, that's what's really going to drive having a successful program. So, as part of that is making the case for process safety as a best practice in order to see all of those benefits that we've been discussing here for the last half hour of reducing incident rates, improving operations, reducing downtime, and improving effectiveness. So, getting that management commitment is really the key starting point of process safety because everything else is going to build on that. As the next step is to review existing programs. So as I mentioned with hot work, there are many elements of process safety that can be built on or that at least tie into existing programs at a facility. Another example of this is emergency response preparedness. So many facilities will already have something in place that can be upgraded, can be modified, can be tied into. Process safety, even though I did highlight that it's separate from occupational safety and it's separate from some of these programs, there still is a huge level of interconnectivity. And so trying to implement process safety without pulling in those different elements that are already in place isn't going to be very effective. It's learning how to build on what's already there. So the next step is to define ownership for process safety as a whole, as well as each element. So tying into what we talked about with some of the key elements today, management of change is typically, I've seen it owned either by EHS or by engineering, by folks who are interfacing with it a lot of the time. Things like mechanical integrity typically belong to the maintenance group, while process safety information oftentimes will belong to the different engineers for the different processes, with that overall ownership usually still landing in the engineering group. So having that sense of ownership, especially whenever you're developing or strengthening these programs, allowing those different groups to really build it in a way that makes sense for them, that they're actually going to want to implement it, that's a huge part of it. We talked a lot about the key elements of process safety. If you are building a process safety or working to upgrade your process safety program with a regulatory requirement, you do need to work on all of those 14 elements, but there's always somewhere that you need to start. So starting with elements such as a documented management of change program or maintaining up-to-date process safety information, choosing those key elements that are both going to have a high impact on safe operations, but also tie into a lot of those different elements, that can be a really fantastic place to start. Things like management of change specifically, it does touch on so many different elements, then that can be a good starting place to build your program around. And then lastly is establish a foundation. Michael mentioned this at the beginning whenever he was talking through the 14 elements and how it can seem somewhat intimidating, especially if you're starting it at either a new facility or one that's just implementing process safety. But programs can develop and grow over time. They don't need to be put in place as a hyper complex and established system all at once. Building up something simple, especially getting that ownership and that buy-in from the people who will actually be using that system, is very important to make sure that it's going to be used. So circling back to management of change, because I have a lot of passionate energy around management of change. Management of change is something that you can start out with a very simple risk assessment, a couple of key parties to approve those changes, and a pre-startup safety review that's drawing on some of those 4 required topics from PSSRs and PSM. You can start out with something very small or very simple, establish that, get people used to using that system, and then as you go through and as you use it more and more, you'll identify the places that it needs to be strengthened or that you need to add to it. But it's getting something in place and getting that foundation in place is the most important thing. They can evolve and grow over time. So those are the very high level starting points for process safety. There's a lot more that we could talk about how to implement a process safety program, but I'm going to hand it back to Michael now to talk about where some of those responsibilities land.
So once you've made that decision to implement a PSM program, now you're left in a position where you need to figure out who does what. It's critical that the implementation of a PSM system previously mentioned by Theresa, is embraced, owned, and supported by all levels of an organization. And the foundation of any good PSM program, like we said, is commitment from management. Certain aspects of implementation, it can be outsourced to third-party consultants, such as a gap analysis or audit. These third-party consultants, they can give advice or technical support for addressing recommendations from the audit, or they can provide the relevant training for personnel. Additionally, consultants can provide one-time support through things like PHAs or QRAs. It should be noted that successful PSM programs, they are inherently a function of the organization's commitment to the program. Companies need to fully buy in to get all of the potential benefits that we have mentioned here today. Next slide. So the takeaways from this webinar should be, if you are already required to implement a PSM program, do so. And if you already have a PSM program or something equivalent, you have to keep improving on it and iterating upon it. If you don't meet the requirements to trigger the requirement of a PSM program, or if you're just outside the US, you should still develop a strategy for mitigating risks and protecting your employees, assets, and the public as well. If you look beyond compliance, you stand to have fewer incidents. And as Theresa stated before, safety is much cheaper than an accident. And safer operations will then mean more efficient operations. Unsafe practices can lead to more downtime, trickier maintenance, and unwise capital spending. Implementing a comprehensive safety program can reduce your organization's financial risk, and you can see the savings through increased process efficiency and lower insurance premiums. Implementing key process safety elements is an industry best practice to prevent incidents, reduce business interruptions, and manage operational risks. And that concludes the presentation portion. Now we'll go ahead and take some time for questions from the audience.
Absolutely. Thank you, Theresa and Michael, for all that information. I am going to go ahead and ask some of the questions that came up. And if you haven't already done so to our attendees, type any of those questions into the Q&A box there in the control panel. So first question for you guys is, what other resources are available to learn more about creating a process safety program?
So there's a lot of really good resources out there depending on which part of implementing process safety you're focusing on. That CCPS monograph on how business decisions or how process safety affects business decisions, that's a really good resource from CCPS on getting that management buy-in and getting that commitment from management. I'd also recommend a lot of CCPS's books. There's one called Guidelines for Implementing Process Safety Management that goes into a lot more detail on some of the topics that we covered today. But I would highly recommend that Center for Chemical Process Safety because they've literally written the book on this.
Right. No, that's helpful. Another question is, does BakerRisk offer additional training for renewable fuel facilities?
Yes, I can take that. So BakerRisk actually offers a range of courses through what we call the BakerRisk Learning Center, and some of the courses we offer have a focus on renewable fuels. In April, we are offering courses specific to hazards and mitigation strategies for biofuels, hydrogen production, and as well, I think we offer courses for carbon capture systems and battery energy systems.
Excellent.
Yeah, additionally, we also offer more general courses for things like PHAs, facility setting studies, quantitative risk assessments, and hazardous area classification. And all these courses, they can be attended in person or virtually.
Excellent. I appreciate that info. So I'm going to ask one last question before we, close this out. But again, to attendees, be sure to type those questions in the Q&A box. What other elements of process safety should be considered first when building a new program?
Yeah, no, that's a good question because there are a lot of those key elements, and we just focused on two of them today. Another one that I would recommend starting with is process hazard analysis, or PHAs. PHAs is another element that ties in so many of the different elements, because whenever you do a PHA, you're looking at your process safety information and it needs to be up to date. You're reviewing your changes and they need to have been documented. And just fundamentally, PHAs allow you to assess the hazards of your process, which is what process safety is intending to do. And so I would highly recommend getting started with at least elementary PHAs, even if you need to build up to maybe a more complex methodology.
Excellent. No, that makes perfect sense. So, thank you guys for answering those, and to everyone who's attended today. I know we've only covered a few of the questions that were asked, and thank you again to Alex for answering the ones in the chat. Just know that our presenters will be answering the rest of the questions, and will send out and post their responses via email, newsletter, and on LinkedIn, and also to our BakerRisk website, which will also have the link to the recorded webinar, slides from this presentation, and the answered questions from the presenters once those have all been completed. So thanks again for joining us today, and be sure to fill out the survey. And our next webinar will be at the end of March, so be on the lookout for that. Thank you so much, Theresa, Michael, and Alex.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.